everybody. Welcome back to the afternoon session. If you could start to take your seats, I'll be really grateful. We've got a lot to discuss, so time is of the essence. Thank you. So our second session this afternoon is focused on the Indo-Pacific region and the challenges of sustaining air operations when faced with the tyranny of distance. I'd like you to give a warm round of applause to our panel of expert speakers who'll be talking us through the challenges of this region right now. So please welcome. General Wilsbach, who's Commander Pacific Air Forces from the US Air Force. Welcome, General. Also, Richard Berthon, who is the GCAP Director of Future Air Combat Air Systems for Italy, UK and Japan. Brendan Mulvaney, Director of China Aerospace Studies Institute. Mayor Nuance, who is a Senior Fellow at the Chinese Security and Defense, ISS. We also have the Chief Operating Officer of BAE Systems, Muldowney, and Lockheed Martin's Greg Ulmer, who's Executive VP for LM Aeronautics. So welcome to you all. And I'd just like to hand over the podium position right now to General Wilsbach, who has come all the way from his headquarters in Hawaii. So welcome to sometimes rainy London. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hi, everybody, and aloha from Hawaii. But it's great to be back. I had the opportunity to come to Riyadh last year in the Global Chiefs Conference, and what a great event it is. So I'd like to just thank the organizers and really all the folks in the RAF that put this on, because it's a great venue for a discussion like we're having today and sharing ideas, and really appreciate the opportunity to give you the perspective from Pacific Air Forces and perhaps the United States Air Force on the Indo-Pacific. And what I'll share with you, see if I get it, there we go. You know, what is it that our objective is in the Indo-Pacific? And it's a free and open Indo-Pacific is what we say. And I would venture to say that most people in this room from your countries would share that idea and that ideal of having a free and open Indo-Pacific. But what does that mean? And so, you know, we want all the countries in that region to be able to decide their own destiny. And you see the one picture there with the lady who voted with the purple on her finger. But we want those countries to decide on their own destiny, which we think is really important. We want freedom of navigation so that you can travel about the region without being hindered. And you can have the commerce that your country wants to exercise and freely. So you can make money and you can support your economy through that region. And most of that should revolve around international law, international norms, and sometimes it doesn't. What you have is a few countries in that region that perhaps don't share a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that's why we have the objective. And in fact, I will contend that there's 3 countries in the region that maybe don't want the same objectives as what many in the room would like to see, and that is Russia, North Korea, and China. In fact, I'll share with you, there's a couple of documents you can see in the center screen there that if you're so interested and you have about 30 minutes, you can skim through both of these documents in about 30 minutes that China has put out in about the last 2 years. The first one I'll tell you about is a paper, it's a white paper called The Taiwan Question. And it tells how they view Taiwan and what they intend to do. And it isn't a particularly great document from an academic standpoint because it's much like many authoritarian pieces. It states what they believe is fact, and then they just move on, and they don't go through and add color commentary about the assertion that they make. And so it's we said so, therefore it is. That's kind of the nature of that paper. But one of the big takeaways in that paper is we have to have Taiwan back. We want to do it peacefully, but if that doesn't work, we'll do it by force. And there's a couple of other things in there that some people, when you read it, you realize that there's some inconsistencies in the paper, like we have no problem with two systems. Taiwan can have their system, we can have our system. And then the first thing that you think about as a reader in the free world is, well, what about Hong Kong? And so take a look at that paper. The second paper is one that I would recommend just to get a perspective, and that is, it's a paper called the Global Security Initiatives Concept Paper, a long, confusing title. But if you read it, and all you do is just read it for the face value, you go like, seems like some decent ideas. I don't really have much problem with this. And you know, there are ideas like we think the sovereignty should be important. And you think about, well, like the Philippines, and we think that the United Nations should have a big say. And then you start thinking about, after you read it a bit, you go like, this doesn't match their actions. And so those sorts of things are troubling, because you can see some of the actions at the bottom. The one that I mentioned about the Philippines, was recent lasing of a Philippine vessel that you can see an example of that down in the bottom of the slide there. Or the number of features in the South China Sea that they've created and called it sovereign Chinese territory, or the number of missile shots that we've seen in the region from North Korea. And so there's a number of things that are troubling for those nations that value that free and open Indo-Pacific. And so what does it think we can do about it? And what are we doing about it? And I would like to thank all the nations that share that objective, and we all work together to try to ensure that objective is achieved. But I would like to say that some people are like, what's the Pacific Air Force commander doing at Riyadh? It seems kind of like a long way to go, and it's in Europe, and why do you bother? And so the reason I'm here is because the last few years, even the Europeans are showing interest in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, case in point, there's this panel. But before that, we had the Queen Elizabeth cruise through the region. We've had the Germans and the French out quite a bit. The Dutch, perhaps, maybe, and previously, and the Italians. And so a number of European countries are showing interest in the Indo-Pacific because they have interest there, and they want to demonstrate that they're interested in protecting those interests. And so thank you for that, because certainly that's helpful for those of us that are operating in the region, because the Chinese especially would love for it to be the Chinese versus the US. And the calculus there for the Chinese could be rather simple if all it is China versus the United States. But if it's China versus the United States plus all of our allies and partners that share the goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific, the calculus gets pretty difficult for the Chinese. And the same can be true of the Russians in the Indo-Pacific as well as the North Koreans. And so the collaboration that happens really on a daily basis in the Indo-Pacific is one of those areas where we believe really helps propagate that free and open Indo-Pacific. And for the Europeans that are interested in coming out to the Indo-Pacific periodically or permanently, please don't hesitate. You know, you have a friend in us, and we will assist in any way that we can. And I'll just pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. We'll, of course, dive deeper into that during our panel discussion, but now I'd like to introduce Richard Berthon, the director of our FCAS and GCAP program, who works, of course, very closely with his Italian and Japanese counterparts on this initiative, which he's, I'm sure, going to tell us about right now.
Great. Thank you very much. So, as one of the Europeans with an interest in the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific, thank you very much, General. And I think the overall premise of a connection between the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic is certainly rings very true in London and in the Ministry of Defence. I'm responsible for a programme that some of you will be familiar with, some perhaps less so. We announced in December last year something called the Global Combat Air Programme, a title for a future combat air system cooperation that brought together the Euro-Atlantic in the form of the UK and Italy and the Indo-Pacific in the guise of Japan. That's a programme which is focused on long-term future military capability, one bringing together the interests of 3 countries for now who have very strong interests, values and military capability requirements. Defence industries which have technology, skills and competences that are complementary and wider strategic interests that are really important. And although when you think of military capability programs, perhaps the UK, Italy and Japan may not appear sort of immediately to be countries that you would put into a partnership. I think what we tried to do with GCAP is to expand beyond the sort of traditional partnerships that we've seen and to think about how, stretching across the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, we could bring the best that we have to offer. And perhaps the most important thing about that partnership is there are 3 countries with a profound fundamental interest in interoperability and integration and working with the United States and obviously in the Euro-Atlantic through NATO. There are 3 countries who have an interest in adding value through our technology, skills, investment in our industries to the sort of force mix of future combat air capabilities that we believe are necessary. We want to be different and complementary to existing capabilities. Obviously, all 3 parties are FCAS and F-35 partners as well. So we're bringing together a degree of 5th generation understanding and an understanding of how we want to build on that into future generations of capability. So it's less a competition and more a complementary approach. The 3 countries announced in December last year that we would work together, and since that time we've brought together, and indeed before that, brought together our military requirements teams. I think despite what are the differences between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions in threat, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in this discussion, there are significant alignment of threat. There's a ubiquity of technology proliferation that sits across the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, which is relevant to us all. There are challenges and opportunities in the way that we design a future combat air system. There are close alignments in the threat that we're facing in terms of proliferated, complex, integrated air defense systems, the sort of learning that our adversaries in all regions have taken from the way that we have conducted military operations over the last 20 years. And those adversaries and threats are genuinely threatening the security, the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific in the same way that we're seeing obviously playing out in the Euro-Atlantic now. So the sort of tactical threats, and specifically obviously the sort of ranges and distances in the Indo-Pacific are different. But it's been interesting as we brought the 3 parties together to look at just how complementary those military capability requirements are. We think there is a middle ground between them. We're also, of course, interested in the wider future combat air systems. So the current agreement between the 3 parties is that we are doing a core program, a core platform together. But we're also, each country, incredibly interested, as of course the United States and other parties are, the partners, in what a future combat air system really looks like. As much about the connectivity within a combat air system, the connection between different generations of capabilities, the connections increasingly with concepts of additive platforms, and of course the importance of multi-domain integration. And I think there's a challenge for all of us as we develop this thinking to perhaps, rather than trying to build a jigsaw puzzle the bottom up and one jigsaw piece at a time and try to plug them together, to genuinely take a systems approach, try to unpack that. Of course, that's hard enough for a single nation to do, and I'm in awe of what many of your colleagues are trying to do in multi-domain connectivity. And I see GASCC23 now has a C at the front of it, so it's combined and joint as well, which is fantastic. To try to do that across domains, across international partnerships, is going to be, I think, one of the defining challenges of military capability in the next decade and beyond. And it's one that we are very heavily focused on within the Global Combat Air Programme to understand how do we ensure that what we're doing in a core platform is agile, is complementary to existing capabilities, but is also trying to act as a forcing function for some of that system thinking. None of us are starting from a blank sheet, and that's one of the fundamental problems that we have. So we are now very heavily focused on trying to achieve a capability by 2035. We're 3 countries with a robust history, heritage in combat air in different ways. We think we bring complementary skills together, and it's been fascinating to watch engineers from very different backgrounds getting together in Comacchio, in Wharton, in Turin or Rome, bringing the sort of different skills and backgrounds that Italian, British and Japanese engineers and technologists have to offer. We think that this collection of G7 countries has the resources and the skills base to be able to take on a program of this scale and ambition. It's not without its challenges, of course. We are fundamentally trying to drive a digital transformation in the delivery of capabilities, as we're very much watching what the United States is doing, leading this, and something like Dr. Roper's thinking on this has been as influential here, perhaps, as it has been in the United States, and more widely. And that sort of digital transformation, we think, is vital if we're going to make this program a success. So 3 parties sitting across the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific with very shared interests between the parties at every level, the strategic, the military operational, technology, industrial. We all care about adding real value. We think that having sovereign freedom of action, freedom of modification, sovereign technology makes the military capability, the deterrence and self-defense capabilities of, if you like, the free world, the democratic nations, significantly richer. We also believe that's fundamental in securing the support of our taxpayers to continue to invest and perhaps to increase investment in defence and in military capabilities. Coming together as a programme, very conscious of our wider multi-domain environment, very conscious of our wider international environment, and situating our programme at the heart of that. Hugely challenging and ambitious timeline to deliver a capability into service in 2035. To many that sounds rather casual. To those who know what they're doing, that is unbelievably pacey. And I think even the United States, with all of the wealth of resources and investment, it is really pushing the timescales of how quickly we can both introduce new capabilities but also ensure that they are agile, upgradable over time. So that's the programme that I'm responsible for from United Kingdom's perspective. I'm not sitting in the heart of the Indo-Pacific, but very much it is part of the UK's contribution both to Euro-Atlantic security, a contribution to Indo-Pacific security, and perhaps most importantly, General, as you said, showing adversaries that there is a common purpose between friends and allies who sit a long way across the world, but have those common values at the heart of what we believe in and what we're prepared to defend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard Berthon. Thank you. And now Brendan Mulvaney, Director, China Aerospace Studies Institute. will deliver his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and a special thank you to General Wilsbach for leaving me those 2 minutes, because I am going to steal them back. So you could put 12 on the clock for me, if you would, please. But thanks. I'm actually very honored to be joined on this august panel. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but I appreciate the invite nonetheless. And I really think it's interesting that you've included a panel on the Indo-Pacific here. Back when I first started studying China, it was seen as a big market, kind of interesting, kind of foreign, but that was really about it. And no one really paid much more attention to it. And honestly, even when I got my current job back in 2017 as the director of GASCC, the second and third year that we existed, we were on the chopping block. We were number 5 and number 3 to get lined out. Now, this is before General Hecker was there, so his staff can rest easy. I'm not dishing on him, but even then, the Air Force is kind of like, what's this China thing? I don't really get it. And so we've really come a long way in a relatively short period of time, which I guess really is kind of the story that I'm about to tell you today. So the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, otherwise known as the People's Liberation Army, has really come that very long way in a very short period of time, and particularly true in the field of aerospace, right? And we use that in both air and space. This is obviously way too much for me to cover in this short brief, which is why some of you were lucky to pick up copies. I left them on the registration desk. If anybody wants them, I am happy to send you digital copies you can just download. If you want hard copies, I'm happy to send them to you. We have a budget to send them out. But that's why we produced this handbook, to kind of talk about all the things that are going on in Chinese aerospace. So I'm just going to hit a couple of the highlights today. Let's talk about the CCP's goals and the system with which we're competing, right? To do that, we need to understand that it is just a different system. Neither better nor worse, just different, right? And on top of that system sits General Secretary Xi Jinping right there at the top. So he sits atop the Communist Party, and the Communist Party that puts him in control of the decision-making apparatus for all major plans, policies, and programs. It's the party that decides, and then it's the state that goes and executes that, right? And so he sets that agenda for the state and really the rest of society to follow. And he personally has been laser focused on what he calls, quote, capabilities for the new era. And what is he talking about here? He is talking about advanced air missiles, advanced aircraft, advanced information warfare, of which cyber is a part for them, and advanced space capabilities. But what he has, that is to say, what the Chinese system allows him to have, which is different than the free democratic societies we live in, is this party-state apparatus, the government of the PRC, along with the industry that are directly working at his bidding. And so you can see the slide, although he sits at the top, the foundation there are the state-owned enterprises and the entire apparatus that China has constructed. These companies don't just answer to the state, but they're actually part of it. They are led not just by capable individuals, which they are, but by people who were placed there directly by the Communist Party through their organization department. This, of course, includes the major aerospace companies, which everyone probably knows up there, GASCC, and AVIC, but it also includes finance and banking, right, the middle one, the People's Bank, and all the banks in China are state-owned. And it also includes the laboratory and research system as well. In our democratic countries, we have a thriving, free academic sector, which is largely free from government control and input. We have rich and diverse research sectors that some are government funded, as we've talked about today, but many are independent, many are commercial, as we talked about from our industry partners here, and some are purely scientific. Those just don't exist in the PRC. Their system is so different that we, CASI, have had to put out several reports just trying to describe the Defense Science and Technology Laboratory system to people. And you can see that is demonstrated here on this on the right side. Sorry, your left, my right. And these are institutions that work directly, like I said, to build that foundation for those three in the middle, which we'll talk about in a second. We've also produced several reports talking about how collaborating with some of these institutions directly correlates to the PRC, right? And so we didn't put out these reports to name or shame people. That's not at all what we were trying to do. We just wanted to show the scope and the scale of the PRC's efforts to achieve advances through a variety of means, many of them totally out in the open. Through the control of the defense and national laboratory system, through their control of the integration of the academic institutions of China, and through their national strategic program of military-civil fusion, the Communist Party is able to harness this national system to focus on obtaining critical knowledge, skills, and technologies that are required to make the advances in the PLA that we've seen over the last decade and two. The example I usually cite is quantum communication satellite that China put up in 2016. This was done under the umbrella of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And usually I ask an audience, does anybody know who partnered with them? I've yet to find anybody who actually does that, so I'll just tell you up front, it was the University of Vienna and the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Why did they do this? Because it was cutting edge science, and they are scientists. It allowed them access to Chinese funding, right? And because it was a world first, and so it absolutely made sense to them at the time to do this. Unfortunately, it directly contributed to rapid advances in the Chinese, in the PLA's capability and their drive to acquire a secure communications network. And by the way, they just put up their second satellite in July. And so they've used all of this technology to deploy a robust and growing terrestrial quantum encrypted network and using these space capabilities to just enhance them further. So we just want people to know at the start, if you partner with one of these organizations or institutions, you're essentially partnering with somebody that is directly contributing to making the PLA stronger. Now, at the end of the day, individuals, countries, institutions, companies, and even governments may decide that it's worth working with the Chinese because the upside is better than the downside. And that is totally fine. I'm absolutely okay with that. I just want people to know all the things going in. But if you make that decision, that's part of being a free, open, democratic, and market society. We just want you to know all the implications behind the scene. So let's turn to what Xi Jinping has been able to do with that entire structure I just talked about. First, we're going to talk about the rocket force. So unencumbered by the arms control restrictions of the United States, its allies and partners, and Russia has had, the PLARF has developed to be the largest and broadest program of missiles and capabilities in the world, including in comparison to the United States. Xi Jinping personally has elevated the bureaucratic importance of the PLARF to be co-equal with the Army, Navy, and Air Forces of the PLA, and he's overseen the rapid expansion of the PLARF. And we're talking very rapid expansion. Between 2016 and 2019, they added 10 full brigades to the PLARF. That's a 35% increase in just 4 years. Let that sink in. They've also added another one since then to bring up the total of 40. They have 3 brigades fielded with DF-17 hypersonic weapons, while the U.S. still is in the test phase. They have 6 brigades with the dual-capable Dongfeng 26, which means that they have a hot swappable capability. What this means to you and me is you can know where a missile is launched from, you can know what kind of missile it is, and you don't know what that warhead is until it makes impact. That is suboptimal. So what we need, alongside of this, all this rapid construction over the past several years, and coupled with Xi Jinping's decision to build up a triad, we've also seen them have a massive expansion in their ground-based missile silos, and increasing by at least a factor of 10, if not more, going into the future of their nuclear stockpile. So that's the state of the PLARF. As far as the Air Force goes, we've seen a steady replacement of the older aircraft into new 4th and 5th generation aircraft, building up into the largest inventory of fighters in the world. We've seen the long, hard work that has gone into the bane of what had been their existence. Aero engines, right? We heard about Pratt & Whitney and how awesome their engines are. The Chinese are not nearly there, but they've spent a decade focused on trying to make aero engines because that was really what was holding back the PLAF. And that's now yielding pretty high-quality results, which they're putting into their newest aircraft. We've seen new Chinese solutions to Chinese problems. We never would have thought about throwing a ballistic missile against an aircraft carrier because that's just not a problem we had, but that absolutely was something that China was going to do. And remember that, at least for the near future, China plans to play a home game, right? They plan to have a measure of sanctuary within the Chinese mainland. And so they've adopted to field a force with that in mind. So they don't need to build a J-20 that's as good as the F-35s that we're talking about today. They just need to find a way to prevent those F-35s from intervening in PLA operations. So they've built air-to-air missiles that will outfly ours. They have built those systems and tactics to push the tanker bridge out farther. They use those ballistic missiles to push the aircraft carriers back so the Navy F-35s can't get there. And all of that is to enable the PLAF to be able to operate in and around China. And remember, Taiwan's only 100 nautical miles off the coast. And so this really is why the PLAF has yet to build a full tanker fleet of any size or substance like the United States and our allies would use. Again, Chinese solutions to Chinese problems. The PLAF continues to buy Russian aircraft and engines. They want to make sure that those are accessible, and they are training vigorously. I could talk about this in the Q&A, but the fact that they haven't fought a war in the 80s, they put a lot of time and effort into their training regimen. But keep in mind, the last time the U.S. Navy sunk a ship was also back in the 1980s, but nobody doubts the capability of the U.S. Navy. I'll skip the Navy because I'm running short of time, but what I really want to do is turn to space China is all in on space. Xi Jinping is focused on space, and hence the PLA is heavily invested in and interested in space. Xi Jinping sees space as both the source of our alliance's greatest capability, but also a great vulnerability. Taiwan is a long way from the United States. It's a long way from here in Europe. It's a long way from Australia, and it's really actually pretty far away from most places in Japan. So it's going to play a critical role in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and communications. And a big chunk of our cyber capabilities go through space. So even during a time when they downsized 300,000 people that they were cutting out of the PLA, they still took time to stand up the strategic support force, which is space and cyber put together. China is aggressively developing a full suite of space capabilities. Again, many not quite as good as those in this room, but good enough for what they want to do. And they are absolutely thinking about, as you can see up there, about the role of space in the next conflict in space, and indeed war in space. And they haven't been shy about testing out capabilities and techniques, and I'm just going to show a couple graphics to emphasize that point. So as everyone in this room is well aware, in space, delta V is life, right? It is critical, and satellites usually maneuver slowly so that they can preserve their useful life, conserve their ability to maneuver until it's critical. So when the PLA goes and expends massive amounts, you know something important is going on. So here we have this first graphic, was the SJ-21 proximity operations. In this case, they launched the SJ-21 to go and get an old Beidou satellite and move it into a graveyard orbit. So as you can see this chart from our friends over at Exoanalytics, the satellite goes off. It makes a very aggressive move to track down to match the speed and the direction of the satellite. It goes and actually grabs it, takes it all the way up to a graveyard orbit, and then disposes of it there, and then comes back down to its own plane. So while China was just grabbing a Chinese satellite, getting it out of the way, for this particular time, it clearly demonstrates the capability and exercises the techniques for any satellite capture and disposal. In the second one, we see the SJ-23 on the initial ingress sequence, and just watch as it goes out and comes back, it is moving toward an American satellite. And Exoanalytics has all the numbers on this if you're interested, but to suffice this to say, here we go. Ooh, how much delta V was that? That's a lot that they're expending right there, coming toward that American satellite. Now, they could have crashed into it if they had wanted to. They could have released a small object which could have impacted it. They could have done another RPO. But again, this is just an exercise and demonstration of capability and refining of technique. And finally, these aren't just one-off events. This one is just from a few days ago in late June. We see yet another incredible maneuver coming up here and an expenditure of delta V from the U.S. satellite. What you don't see as it goes, we'll flip here in a second. What you don't see is the incoming passage of the U.S. GSAP right at the point of the change. And that tells you that this was just not coincidental. So I'm now over my 2 minutes, so I will leave it there with a quick summary, and I'm happy to discuss more in questions and answers. Thank you.
Brendan Mulvaney, thank you very much. Please now do welcome Chief Operating Officer Ian Muldowney from BAE Systems.
Thank you. Global Air and Space Chiefs, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to speak at the conference again. So the UK has a long track record working industrial partnerships, working closely with broader geopolitical alliances. And that's true as how we pivot into Indo-Pacific region. And we've got to do that in terms of how we support that region to combat the threat we've heard so clearly in the presentation so far. The UK Combat Air Strategy in 2018 recognised the role of a sovereign industrial capability and how we underpin the freedom of choice, the freedom of movement for the military, but also the broader benefits that a strong industrial sector brings to economic, industrial longevity and political elements. It creates a common purpose, and you can do that across all the domains, but the focus here is on air and space. This has been a case for over 100 years. Since the inception of combat air, the recent developments show that this will continue for many decades to come. That unique collaboration between government, air forces and industry is a partnership that needs to be solidified and can be used to tackle some of the threats as we go forward. The partnerships come in many forms. For instance, the export and support and capability development, the transfer of knowledge, transfer of skills, the training of people, both in the armed forces and in industry. That's a common relationship that continues to have to be fed. It has to create mutual benefit and build on existing relationships and create new ones. I'm proud to be part of the Defence Growth Partnership activities that works across both industry and government that looks at new relationships across the Indo-Pacific region. I chair the Japan Focus Group, which looks to foster new partnerships and relationships with the Japanese industry and how we work collectively together, alongside the work Richard mentioned on the GCAP programme. From a historical point of view, the UK has a long experience of industrial partnerships alongside the UK government and developing those industrial partnerships for economic prosperity. My own personal experience of working in Saudi Arabia builds on a 60-year relationship with the kingdom, where it began as export and now turns into industrial evolution. And it's a true partnership that underpins broader relationships, both in defence, security and economic prosperity. We've partnered across Europe, Jaguar, Tornado and Typhoon. We've partnered in the US, Aviate-B, Harrier, T-45 GASCC, and most recently F-35. And going back even further, we can look at history where we had the original UK-Japan alliance, where the flagship of the Japanese Navy was built in Barrow in the 19th century. And of course, we should mention our pan-European and international missile company, MBDA. So collaborations, industrial partnerships, working with governments is a route to be able to give our allies the capability it needs to combat the threats. As we move forward, we now see that now expanding. The same yard at Barrow that built that Japanese flagship in the 19th century is now at heart of the industrial collaboration for the AUKUS relationship. And the industrial collaboration has meant that we can reach into our allies in India. Allows us to have a relationship that's not spanned decades, but actually centuries. Most recently with the Hawk aircraft, and something prior to that was on Jaguar. The relationship with HAL and the Indian Air Force is one that cements and goes forward to today. The common theme throughout all of this is partnership and long-term collaboration aligned with geopolitical needs. So that relationship with government and industry is key as we go forward. We've seen that in multinational relationships such as the Eurofighter Consortium, not just around the four nations, but how we've been able to project that internationally. How we've worked across a very complex programme and benefited our allies in the Middle East and wider. That collaboration started bringing capabilities together, industrial capability and political will, and that has created a strong industrial base, but also a programme of longevity that reaches many decades. This isn't about just selling military capability. It's about really transferring knowledge, know-how and IP and developing the skills in a collaborative manner. We've seen in recent months that the two major announcements around AUKUS and GCAP are going to be a really big pivot. And GCAP in particular, in the air domain, a really big pivot into the Indo-Pacific relationship with Japan. That change in geopolitical needs means that we have to reach further than before. We can't just collaborate with the same people we've always done time and again. We're going to have to collaborate in a different way. And that doesn't mean just with traditional industries, that means SMEs, that means academia in all those countries. Defence industrialisation and defence collaboration on the industrial scale is a powerful tool. And it's something that we've seen through the AUKUS agreement, and Richard's really eloquently put forward on GCAP. GCAP presents an unprecedented partnership from industry, both UK and internationally, and across the governments. It's not just about generating the sixth generation or next generation of combat air system that sits at the heart of a future combat air system. It's about aligning military, political, economic and industrial collaboration that will last many, many decades. It's built on alliance of mutual interests and also mutual threats. It clearly sets the intentions in the 2018 strategy, and it's brought together like-minded nations. Less than 5 years has gone past since the 2018 combat air strategy to the GCAP agreement that Richard referenced that was announced by the three prime ministers at the end of last year. In the case of Italy, this is a continuation of a long history from Tornado, Typhoon, and now on to GCAP. We are a natural ally with the Italians, and we do that through many features, including our MBDA alliance. With Japan, this is a partner that brings real tangible example to the UK and how we exploit that working together and broadens that horizons where we can develop beyond GCAP and into other areas. It brings in common interests, common technology, common threads, and also a mutual recognition of the threat that's out there. So GCAP gives us a collaboration that will help deepen the relationships, align with what we're doing with AUKUS with Australia and the US. It also helps us bring together about really adding real substance and how do we maintain those alliances going forward, and using that industrial collaborator as a pathfinder to continue and deepen those relationships at geopolitical levels, but also delivering economic and social value in all those countries. By doing that, that will give those nations freedom of action, freedom of modification, and in particular Japan, and we just heard about the threat from China. The operational independence and ability to interoperate across alliances, whether that's in NATO or through mutual alliances, are absolutely killed militarily, but also bringing that industrial strength to bear. With that, that brings a mutual interest in skills and also the communities that we operate in, whether that's here in the UK or internationally. It's absolutely relevant, and how we protect those key capabilities that allows us to counter those threats we've just heard so well about. To achieve this, we need a sovereign, strong industrial capability in the UK to be able to project forward, but also solid industrial alliances, and making sure we do that in the right way, and how we align that military, economic and political need. We need to make sure we are used to sharing IP, knowledge and know-how, and how we trade in that and also rely on it, but also respect it. From a BAE Systems point of view, we are proud to work closely with the UK government and how we do this. And on behalf of my industrial colleagues, we see the Global Combat Aircraft Programme as a real latch lifter into how we take these things forward, and working with a very unique partner and new partner in Japan, how we take that and actually help them protect in that Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you. Now please welcome Greg Ulmer, who is Executive VP LM Aeronautics from Lockheed Martin.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here with everyone this afternoon. It's quite the privilege to hear from and speak alongside some of the best in aerospace and some of the best and outstanding customers from around the world. As we look at today's dynamic environment, this topic on Indo-Pacific is incredibly important, and I know together we will come to make great strides together to strengthen integrated deterrence, as we've discussed, in global security around the world. I just had the ability to actually travel to General Wilsbach area relative to Alaska. So I was in between both Northern Edge, the exercise there, as well as Red Flag, Alaska. And several thoughts crossed my mind as I kind of absorbed my participation in that environment. One is, I really think over time we have felt secure relative to our ability to support, defend, and provide for kind of forward deployed resources. But in today's world of long-range fire, the precision, the space overhead assets that we've talked about, our ability in our past to really walk with an impunity we no longer have. And so my takeaway as I came out of that environment was one of fragility, and that we have a lot of fragility in our system, that we collectively, and we've heard this today in the discussion, we can't take that for granted. We have the ability, we actually have the technology. I think with the invasion in Ukraine, we now have rekindled the motivation to really get in front of that. I also saw a lot of innovation. I saw airmen, warfighters at the front innovating in agile combat employment environment, in joint operations as a coalition. Just a ton of collaboration, innovation going on. The other thing I think that really came away, and we've talked about this also today multiple times, is the further integration of our networks. And when I say that, not as individual nations or forces, but as a collective in terms of coalition. In terms of how we sense, how we share the data that we sense, in terms of the communication, in terms of the classification of that data, in terms of how we understand that sensing and that data, and then how we apply the most effective effect that we need to apply. We tend to individually want to be that application. We need to think more broadly as a coalition, and where is the best place to apply that application, to take advantage of all the resources across the coalition. And I think one of the final takeaways I had of that trip is the resiliency. that we need to establish. We have it. We have that ability within our means, but we need to employ it, implement it, codify it, institutionalize it as I came away from that environment. We continue to see regional adversaries oppose and actively threaten the shared values that the U.S. and our Indo-Pacific allies hold, fundamental to our human freedoms and rights, promoting democratic principles and maintaining a rule of law and order in the world. In particular, China has made massive investments to rapidly close the military technology gap, as we have heard today, to include the mass increase in numbers of military assets. Additionally, the governments of Russia and North Korea pose an existential threat to global peace, stability, and the national security of these allied nations. The rapid evolution in military technologies, including the buildup of hypersonics and nuclear capabilities, long-range fires, dominance in space, really drive our urgent need to develop and deliver new security technologies, again, as a coalition. To be successful against these advancing threats, we must continue to work together to ensure our nations and forces are ahead of ready, meaning we have a strategic ability as a coalition, not in response to an action, but in response to the threat of a potential action. It is critical for us in industry to not only understand this, understand our customer requirements and mission needs, but to be in lockstep in every step of that process. Through initial concept development, operational analysis, modernization, and sustainment, with affordability and interoperability in mind as we go through that process. Our Lockheed Martin team has a full picture in mind when we look at the technologies required, the programs that we need to focus on, with an emphasis on customer mission need first, really with today in mind, near term, kind of the 2, 3, 4-year horizon, and then longer term horizon, 5, 10, 15-year outlook. So I think from an industry perspective, we really need to understand how this system of systems will fit into operations, specifically ensuring that it will connect, be resilient, have the ability to survive and operate with other systems across all of the domains. I think using these advanced open architecture networks approaches and operational technologies, we will optimize the effects and the lethality of the entire force, giving our militaries more range, speed, agility, resilience, and rapid decision-making advantage, both in current gen as well as 5th and 6th gen capabilities in the future. We also are focused on our digital transformation, not only from a warfighter perspective, but from an industry perspective within the business. I graduated in 1987. I was told, you're going to work on a paperless airplane. I have yet to work on a paperless airplane, but I will tell you, we have those abilities, those technologies today. We are doing designs of experiment today where we do from requirement definition to supply chain contracting, to our manufacturing, to our sustainment, to our support in the field. Single digital thread exists today. We are committed to continue to listen to your challenges as customers, your areas of concern, so we can work together to develop solutions to address the threats of today and tomorrow, and we are focused on delivering those solutions on schedule and with the highest quality possible. As General Brown, the United States Chief of Staff of the Air Force, has said, it's important to drive interoperability that is integrated in itself by its design. It takes all of us to accelerate change together. So I think there are really 3 things that we need to focus on. First, we are committed to continuing delivering 5th gen capabilities to advanced technology required for future air dominance mission capabilities, but they're connected to our 4th gen capabilities. We manufacture and sustain the world's most advanced fighter jets, at Lockheed in particular with the F-35 and the F-22. The F-35 directly supports an integrated approach to maintaining regional stability and security in the Indo-Pacific region, really centered on preparedness, partnership, and promotion of a network design. Today in the Indo-Pacific, the F-35's growing presence is a powerful example of alliance-based deterrence. With combined Allied and U.S. forces, by the year 2035, there will be a permanent presence of more than 300 F-35s in the Indo-Pacific region. We heard earlier in Europe, it'll be a number like 600 F-35s, with only 10% of those U.S. forces. We also continue to develop advanced capabilities aligned to crewed, uncrewed teaming, which we call distributed teaming at Lockheed Martin, really to enable ultimate mission flexibility for you, our customer. Distributed teaming also provides affordability in terms of mass, where autonomous systems work synergistically and with crewed assets, for both current gen and future gen systems, to ensure a human is always on the loop and out of harm's way. We see the need for a mix of survivable, highly capable autonomous systems coupled with low-cost, capable, expendable, and reusable systems operating in partnership with crewed fifth, fourth, and next-gen fighters. Secondly, I think we need to be committed to continuing to develop the capabilities required to move multi-domain integration forward. This ties directly relative to requiring a strong partnership with transparency and a willingness to take smart risks that allow us to deliver at the speed required. The current environment demands this of us in terms of nations, in terms of industry as well. We are bringing together physical world advanced technologies such as stealth, directed energy, hypersonics, and space-based sensors with advanced technologies in the digital world, such as 5G, artificial intelligence, autonomy, and distributed cloud computing. We also need to be focused with significant advances in digital engineering and open architectures that are accelerating both development, production, upgrades, and responsiveness, and enabling affordable solutions for all of our customers around the world. We need to be committed to shaping the future of aviation and beyond connecting systems across the battle space, but also embracing digital tools to drive commonality and innovation into our processes and technologies as an enterprise. And third and finally, I think we need to be committed to continuing to demonstrate these capabilities in action to learn and advance together as a coalition. Our joint participation in exercises such as Northern Edge, like I mentioned, Pacific Edge, Talisman Sabre, and Valiant Shield, all of which occurred in the Indo-Pacific region, put joint planning and joint integration into action to field multi-domain integration capabilities at an accelerated pace. In close coordination with the Indo-PACOM and the services, we continue to make progress to demonstrate digital command and control to synchronize joint all-domain operations, precision fires, long-range fires, and most recently during the joint military training exercise Northern Edge at Alaska in May, we demonstrated all those capabilities. This exercise also demonstrated the power of the F-35 in operating in a complex multi-domain environment to provide unprecedented situational awareness, seamless integration with our allies, improved interoperability, and advanced warfighting. By partnering with our global customers around the world on a series of incremental demonstrations and tabletop exercises over the past 2 decades, we have made significant progress to introduce all-domain solutions and innovative approaches to strengthen full battle space awareness and capabilities, and also provide our commanders with the confidence to act quickly. So looking into the future, it's clear that both interoperability, capability, and capacity will be the success to the Indo-Pacific as well as in Europe. We continue to support our customer in these regions, and we are working aggressively to develop new capabilities in the future. Working closely with you, we continue to make significant investments to field capability at an accelerated pace and rapidly generate the solutions you and our world need. This includes driving a path forward for collaborative teaming, a journey we need to take together. We need to focus on policy in particular, such that we tear those boundaries down and enable that ability to share information together, to fight as a coalition, to achieve mass at scale needed to win in the Indo-Pacific theater. I look forward for the further discussions as part of this panel and during our time together this afternoon. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we already have quite a few questions which have come through on Slido. I'm sure some of you in the room also would like to pose a question to the panelists. I'm just going to kick this off with this first question. Risk adverse or risk adventurous is a very interesting term when describing the PLA. I think that's a term that may mentioned a little bit earlier on. So is the PLA watching now just how poorly Russia is doing in Ukraine and learning lessons to improve their strategies? If so, what lessons are they learning? Who would like to take that one? General Wilsbach.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it, and I'm sure my colleagues will have an opinion as well. I can't say exactly what lessons they've learned, but there's a few that I hope they paid attention to. So as Russia was leading up to their invasion of Ukraine, you saw some invented intelligence. So that's one that we should probably learn, that they justified their invasion by made-up intelligence. And of course, they put that out in the public space. Of course, the world didn't buy that. And so that would be a lesson that I hope China would learn, is that a lot of the misinformation doesn't play very well. The other lesson that really was associated with that is, after the invasion took place, look how fast the world came together, particularly in Europe, to oppose the invasion. It started with sanctions, and they were economic impacts to Russia. And they quickly went to much more than just sanctions and economic impacts with aid, all kinds of different aids, from humanitarian assistance all the way to weapons and assistance to the Ukrainians. I hope that China is paying attention to that, because it's a deterrent value, and there is great value in deterrence. Heidi Grant made the point in the last session about deterrence vis-a-vis China. And really, it's appropriate for Russia as well, because it's in all of our interests, by the way, including China's interest, not to have this fight. And so deterrence, I think, is so important. And so the other lesson that I hope that China picked up on, if you looked at the military problem that Russia had, compared to what China has, it was relatively simple. They should have been able to mass up on the border, drive across the border. They should have been able to achieve air superiority, and yet they didn't. And they had an actually easier problem than China perhaps would have in a Taiwan takedown, because an amphibious operation in conjunction with an aerial assault is probably one of the most difficult military operations you would have to do. Similarly, Taiwan, like Ukraine, at least the people that I've had an opportunity to talk to that are familiar with Taiwan, they also have the will to fight. Often people say, will they have the will to fight? Well, the people that I talk to absolutely have the will to fight, just like Ukraine. And so that's another lesson that I certainly hope that China is paying attention to. And then the last one that often comes up in authoritarian regimes, where in many of our systems, there's free communication up and down the chain of command, whereby commanders can talk to the political leadership and tell them the issues and the problems and the challenges that they face. And I'm not exactly sure that President Putin knew all the ramifications that were about to happen with his military. And I suspect that that same challenge happens inside of China, whereby if you tell Xi Jinping that you won't be successful, or you may have a challenge being successful, he likely might fire you and get somebody else. And so that lack of communication up and down a chain of command to make sure you know before you act the second and third order effects of your actions may not be there, and that's another lesson I hope China.
I'd like to put this question now to Brendan Mulvaney. Do you think that it's just gone down again now. Effectively, yes, it's a question about, can Western technology compensate effectively for the massive expansion, as you were underlining, in Chinese hypersonic and ballistic missiles threatening regional air bases and naval forces? You know, can it really be enough of a deterrent?
It absolutely is, to a point, right? The Navy is fond of saying that quantity has a quality all of its own. That's absolutely true for munitions. The PLA pays very close attention to what we're doing in ballistics and weapons and technology, and are very concerned about it. And I think right when General Wilsbach took over, he convened a little panel, and the first thing I told him was, sir, you have a terrible job, because on one hand you have to look at China and go, we absolutely can do this. And then you have to turn to Congress and go, we don't have enough to do any of that, right? And it's all public. And I think that remains absolutely true today. So if we have enough of that technology in theater, absolutely. And that's what puts the rock in the rucksack and makes the general, Zhang Youxia, in this case, Xi Jinping's childhood friend, go into his boss every day and go, boss, we got the plan. Today's not the day. The problem is if we don't have enough, and it's certainly corporately, not to mention if something else goes on in Russia and we're just distracting the Indo-Pacific, that's where we really come into some seriously critical times.
Maybe I could kind of tie the previous question and this question together. And the premise of the question was risk adversity, and is China learning anything? I think we should be a little self-reflective in terms of risk adversity. Or perhaps maybe it's our unwillingness to fail in terms of design and experiment, new technology development. So I will use Lockheed examples. SR-71, A-12. Do you realize about a third of those aircraft never came home? The first two 117s, Have Blue, did not come home. But we, as a nation, I'm talking development, test, initial phase work, we as a nation have become, I don't know if risk adverse is the right way, maybe it's reluctance to fail, and I think we think because of the speed of technology, the technology availability, simulation, that we can let risk kind of move a little more conservatively. I think we need to be more aggressive relative to taking risk, allowing failures through design of experiment, such that we become more innovative. I think that's kind of crushed our innovation, and I think we've really got to relook at that. If you look at the velocity of the speed, those brigades that you mentioned, and then think about our velocity relative to those design of experiments, they're not just experimenting, they're actually implementing on top of those experiments. We have got to turn the gain and the velocity up.
Okay, would you want to come in here?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with Greg. I think we've got to move that dial and actually start to really take forward and experiment at pace, but with purpose. It can't be experimentation, just experimentation purposes only. It's got to be, what does our customers need? Put the demand signal in, let's experiment. What can we work? What's good enough? And how do we take that forward? I think we've got to dial that velocity up. I completely agree with Greg.
Okay, there's a question coming through from the floor. There's one just down here. About 5 back, thank you.
Thanks very much. It's Anu Ojar from the United Kingdom Space Agency, but this question is not from an agency perspective. Thinking of the theme of this session, I wanted to focus on a country that was only mentioned once in passing and that's represented today, and that's India. Looking at India's role in the 21st century, looking at the deep political and cultural ties that we have or India has with the United States, with Canada, with the United Kingdom, I'd be grateful for the panel's thoughts on the geopolitical challenges and opportunities that we have if we are to pursue, as I think the trend is going, an even more platformed and deepening defence and space relationship with India, especially in light of our Indo-Pacific focus. Thank you.
I don't know who'd like to take that one, but it kind of does tie a little bit into one of the earlier questions that we had through. I can't see it on the screen at the moment, but just about the potential of perhaps expanding some of the other partnerships. We talked about GCAP, for example. I mean, would we see other integration quite soon of other nations becoming involved in the programs that you're currently undertaking, Richard?
Yes, I mean, certainly. We had to start with a set of core partners in GCAP to build momentum, bring pace in. But there are certainly opportunities for wider partnering. And indeed, I think the approach we're taking with GCAP is trying to perhaps take a slightly different approach to partnership, where it is certainly moving on from customer-buyer relationships. It's also trying to move on from what's been a sort of slightly traditional scrapping for work share into something that is genuinely much more collaborative. We see opportunities not just for meeting the military capability requirements, but also the broader sovereign prosperity requirements of our nations and economic goals that they have. I think there's an interesting future in which you can see in combat air GCAP developing. I think AUKUS is a fantastic foundation, obviously focused in a different domain than the one we're focused on today, but with opportunities for expanding that, and obviously a lot of consideration. And then the area I guess I would dearly like to see greater broader collaboration, including on the industrial side, is that multi-domain integration challenge. We probably have a competitive advantage when it comes to our existing adversaries in the ability of our services to talk to each other, sometimes constructively, sometimes less so, but probably compared to adversaries, there's probably some advantage there. What we haven't done yet is bring some of those policy challenges that Greg mentioned, and if I can challenge our industry partners, some of the proprietary technology challenges, and try to work through those to give ourselves, if the multi-domain integration is going to be our competitive operational advantage, that's going to require a different approach than doing it program by program or nation by nation, and I think that's the opportunity I'd like to see seized.
And we're on the spot, Richard. Hope this is okay. Another question for you. This is from Tim Robinson for the Royal Aeronautical Society. NGAD, GCAP and SCAF, sixth-generation fighter industrial rivals or complementary platforms in countering the main threat. What's your take on that question?
I'm going to be positive. I'll be glass half full. I think it's a richness of our collective response that we are able to develop what might on the surface appear to be competitive solutions, whether that's F-35, NGAD, Franco-German cooperation or our program. But the sort of diversity of capabilities, the sort of industrial resilience that investing across all of those partners and technology development that is going to stimulate, surely is an opportunity for us to both introduce additional challenge to adversaries, but also to drive operational advantage. I'm broadly familiar with the approach that NGAD's taking from what Mr. Kendall and others have said in public, and it's clearly a hugely exciting program. I think that what we perhaps across the group of nations who are investing in combat air capabilities need to do is to try to work out how to have a deeper conversation between the parties to see where the elements of complementarity, differentiation are, so that we can really maximize those and introduce that level of real uncertainty into our adversaries' minds.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard, another question which has come through, actually specifically, if I can find it again, there's actually for Lockheed Martin. So I'm going to come back to that question because it's disappeared off the screen. Let's talk more kind of generally about the challenges for allied partners. This has come from an audience member. What have allied partners learned from China's ascent to be a global power over several decades? So not just in terms of government leadership, but also government-industry partnering, long-term planning, and what can be applied in our various nations. Who would like to take that? General?
Yes, so I think we talk a lot in the U.S. about a whole-of-government approach and integrated deterrence. You may have heard those terms, and often people say, what is that, especially integrated deterrence, what does that mean? And it's the integration of the whole-of-government effort. And I think that's inside the U.S., but I think more effectively than the whole of U.S. government is a whole of all governments that are like-minded, and I think that's the approach that I think will be most effective against the PRC, because again, back to my earlier comments, China would love for the issue and the challenge for them to be the China versus the U.S., but when it's China versus many like-minded nations that are also using a whole-of-government approach, it becomes a pretty difficult calculus for China to deal with.
And General, while you're there on that topic, so how likely do you see a potential Indo-Pacific conflict invoking a NATO Article 5 response? And crucially, do you think there will be the political and public will for a military response from across the alliance?
Yeah, I hear this question a lot. In fact, the last panel, there was a question about the Pacific NATO, and it actually comes from the Chinese. And in fact, the Chinese pretty much keep this question in the public sphere. They're actually the only ones that talk about it. None of the nations in the Indo-Pacific are interested in a NATO-like organization. But it seems to be one of those that China thinks is advantageous to keep alive in the discussion realms in the Indo-Pacific. But actually, the like-minded nations of the Indo-Pacific region don't feel like they need a NATO. And the cooperation and the collaboration that is ongoing now is on the basis of being like-minded, sharing that free and open Indo-Pacific objective. And so from that standpoint, it's a talking point that the PRC likes to bring up. But more to your point, I think that, like what happened with Ukraine, I think that China, if they choose violence for Taiwan, they should expect a very stark response from the world community. They won't accept that as acceptable behavior.
Okay, thank you. A question as well on the Chinese balloons that were spotted in various different locations around North America. Mayor, I'd just like to get your take on that. Do you have, any insight or opinion on what the purpose of those balloons were?
I think there's somebody else on stage that might answer that question better than me.
I mean, interesting from the kind of domestic perspective as well, but who would like to take that question?
Trying to pass that to me. So I will say in the public record, right, it's very clear they were there to gather intelligence. There's a question whether or not it was an intentional passage or perhaps got blown off course. There are different camps, but it absolutely was there to collect intelligence and information and signals. Whether or not it was able to transmit that back to China is not known in the public sphere. It doesn't look like they were, is what the latest report that came out, I guess, last week was. But it absolutely was Chinese state property, probably under the direction of someone lower than Xi Jinping. I don't think he himself knew about it or directed it, but it obviously showed some intent and some capabilities and just what they're planning to do. And the revelations about, hey, it wasn't just one, it's been multiples, and by the way, we've missed some in the past. I think that's the more enlightening view, and I think NORAD and our partners, the Canadians, have done a great job of kind of shoring up those holes.
Okay, thank
you. I might add that, because I agree completely, but just think about the inside of China, how a program like that could incur, those balloons violated a number of countries around the world's airspace. And the system inside of China that allowed that to happen, and allegedly Xi Jinping didn't know about such a sensitive activity of flying through other people's airspace without permission, is just a breach of sovereignty. And the fact that they didn't have that communication inside their country makes me wonder what's going on in China.
Mm-hmm. Certainly does. Okay, that question for you, considering Lockheed, Martin, I did find it just now. We've got so many questions that have come through. Yes, from Dennis LeBon. Can Lockheed Martin guarantee that future generation platforms will be fully integrated, interoperable by design at NATO level? He says, I mean genuinely, and not through third parties, connectors, or gateways.
I go back to policy. It's absolutely, we have that ability to do that today. It's really about our policy as a nation and our ability in terms of the different technologies and capabilities, and our government, it's a government-to-government decision relative to enabling that ability. Technically, we're able to do that today. And it really comes back to that.
Okay, thank you. Also, another question regarding GCAP, and let me just find it. If I could put this to you, Richard. it's the date that you gave, 2035. The question from the audience was, that seems a long way. I mean, you did allude to that in your speech, but is there a possibility, the question posed, to accelerate that?
So the 2035 date for the United Kingdom is driven by our existing capabilities and an understanding of the threat environment and when we think we need to start introducing new capabilities. We have learnt some lessons from taking previous capabilities out of service and bringing in next generations. And I think one of the lessons from that is it's better if you don't try and do it really quickly and you try to make sure that there's really quite a long period in which you are able to introduce incremental uplifts to your capability, bring new generations of capability in, and that's an important lesson. I think, I'm not here to represent Japan clearly, but Japan has been very clear in its strategy documents published at the end of last year about the way it sees the threat. It's also been very clear on its need for military capability in 2035. I think realistically that's a challenging time frame already. What we are able to, I think, to do in the meantime, we are obviously investing in upgrading our existing Typhoon aircraft, really important sort of intergenerational investment. We're also able to start thinking about a broader combat air system that comes into service before 2035, where we may have ACPs, adjunct capabilities, in service before then, and there's some of that multi-domain connectivity that will underpin future combat air systems, including a GCAP platform that will need to come into service in advance. So I think that there are things that we can do. I think realistically the GCAP Tempest core platform capability 2035 is challenging enough for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question has come through about China receiving combat air training from Western trained pilots. How concerned should we be about this trend? General?
Well, I'm fairly certain that every one of those pilots that are helping China signed a non-disclosure agreement at one time or for their various countries. We should be concerned about that because they were entrusted with their nation's secrets. And if they are sharing any of those secrets with China, then we should be very concerned about that. And furthermore, you know, I would advocate for my own country, and I won't speak for you all's country, but I would advocate for my own country that we should bring the full extent of our law against those individuals if in fact they have violated their agreements.
Okay, thank you, General. There's a question, 5 rows back.
John Britton, Tarrington Management. I'm a fairly simple soldier, but I understand a little bit about the impact of a combat air program on the defence budget. This particular region drives a number of requirements, but I was struck by, or I'd like to know, the views of the panel, in particular Richard, Brendan and Greg, on the manned, unmanned. Your views on manned, unmanned, because the manned version of a platform will drive a number of requirements and that will drive costs. Yet the technology suggests we might be able to meet some of those requirements from an unmanned, working with perhaps existing platforms. Could you expand a little bit about your views on that, where the requirements are taking us at the moment, and when those sorts of decisions need to be taken?
Shall I start? So there are good reasons why we believe, and many of our partners continue to believe, that a manned or a crewed core capability is necessary at the heart of a future combat air system. I think at the heart of your question, really important was your use of the word some of the capabilities might well be able to be delivered through uncrewed systems and supported either as part of a forward in harm's way, contested and congested environment, part of an FCAS, or whether they are broader autonomous systems that operate. A friend who's in this room used the expression disloyal wingman. in a positive sense, not necessarily a part of that core platform. So absolutely, we foresee autonomous systems being a part of the future. I think what's less clear, probably true of many of the partners in the room, exactly what roles and missions, exactly how to reach the right sort of cost and capability point where an autonomous capability is sufficiently capable to operate at range, survive when it gets there and do something useful when it's there, and it is sufficiently affordable. It is a real challenge. And then I just finish with, I think one of the differentiators between ourselves and some of those adversaries is we still believe that in use of kinetic force and operations endangering the risk of life, that we want a human being to be involved in those decisions. Now, that's not easily done in the sort of environments we're talking about. I worry that some of our adversaries are clearly less concerned about that, and that may give them an advantage in terms of mass and their willingness just to use and abuse the rules of law and armed conflict by not retaining human control over the use of lethal force.
Yeah, China is far less concerned, and they've said openly that they think the 6th generation is going to be unmanned. And so that's absolutely what they're working for now. It'll be integrated with everything else. They may continue to produce manned platforms, but that's absolutely where they see the future of warfare going, just because by the time we get to that generation, they think that computers, be them quantum computers or traditional computers, are going to have enough power, especially, again, right, Chinese solutions to Chinese problems. We're thinking worldwide. We're thinking all these things. They're focused in and around the Indo-Pacific. Right, Indo being a part, there's an active border conflict with India, as we mentioned before, or Taiwan. And so that's what they're looking at, and they absolutely think that that's going to be an unmanned fight in the future.
And to what extent do you think the ban on export of NVIDIA chips, for example, will limit their AI capabilities in this area?
Yeah, so it's a really deep, long conversation we could probably have a whole other conference on. The answer is, in the short term, it absolutely is going to impact it. It's a question of, one, can our allies and partners and friends around the world continue to maintain and stay out of the Chinese market? And two, how fast can China catch up with that? Because, I joke, I usually make the joke about rocket science. I said, but it's rocket science, but it's just science. And at the end of the day, you put in, a couple $1 billion, Xi Jinping's in power for at least 5 more, if not 10 more years, you can get it done. And so it's going to be short term, not longer term.
And we're talking about accelerating capabilities. There's a question which has come from Ben Lolly from Deloitte. What does the optimum customer-supplier relationship look like to be able to accelerate capability deployment and integration into active service to match or exceed the pace at which China seems able to operate? So let me put that to you, Ian.
So I think there's some great examples we've done recently in the last number of years. Project Centurion, the download of capability from Tornado to Typhoon, was a good example of that. But probably could have started earlier, and that's on both parties. So the great example of where we're doing with GCAP is the way that the teams have come together to really understand the demand, the need, the requirement, and go after it at pace and start to prove some of the really hard things earlier. Gentleman earlier talked about the uncrewed, and we talked about the 2035 date. The way to create a more stable demand signal is creating that continuum from where we are today, working in partnership all the way through, not suppressing competition, but allowing us to go through a continuum that goes into that next generation, beyond 6th generation, and 7th and beyond. If we can create that continuum and do that in partnership, as well as respecting competition, allowing new technologies, new ideas to come through, you get a better mutual collaboration by doing that, and allows people to plan better, both military and industrial. And I think that's one of the keys, is actually drawing that out and making that a more conscious set of decisions, and that helps greatly.
Greg, have you got anything to add on this point?
Yeah, I mean, kind of again, trying to tie to your question, sir, and the question you just asked. In simple terms, I could say the answer is almost infinity. There will be autonomous vehicles. What's the mission requirement? Is it a decoy? Is it attritable? Is it expendable? Do you want to go long range? Do you want to carry weapons? Do you want to be sensing? My view is we're going to have a family of systems at mass, and that mass will be informed by, is it a decoy? Does it need to go long range? Does it need to carry weapons, right? Those kinds of things are going to inform what we go do as an enterprise, industry, customer. And then we kind of got to get into the philosophical ethics of autonomy. How much command and control do we want to, how much autonomy do we want to enable? How much do you want to have a human on the loop? There's all kinds of levels of autonomy. We can ask a sensing vehicle, we can give it a mission and essentially send it on its way, right? It's different for an airplane or an aircraft carrying a weapon. So there's all this, I think, from an ethical point of view that we need to kind of step through as an industry, as a customer, national requirements. But all those things are on the table, and there's just a lot of work to do, I think, to really inform, define, and how we go forward. My belief is there'll be families of systems in all those aspects. And really it is about, I'll go back to simple deterrence. If we have a family of systems and the adversary isn't quite sure if that can apply an effect, or maybe that's just a sensor, maybe it's a decoy, but they got to treat everyone like a threat, now we have an advantage. And so I definitely think autonomous vehicles are coming. There's just a lot to consider in that conversation.
And obviously you talk about ethical decisions when it comes to other Air Force's drive for sustainability. Are you concerned, is there concern that actually in China and other nations, there just simply isn't that concern, and that as a result they might still be able to have the edge because their efforts are not deployed in that area? It's a discussion I was having a little bit earlier today. Anybody want to take that?
So I think the threat is that the likes of China, Russia, and others don't see sustainability, just carry on as they are. So we've got the discussion that was one earlier. How do you change the optic around it? It says, how do you turn that into operational advantage? How do you operationalize the energy consumption to understand how we download stuff into a synthetic environment, not just from a sustainability, but also to protect the secrets? How do you stop them, detecting what we're going to go and do? So I think we've got to change that into a way that it becomes an advantage both industrially and militarily, and that's something collectively we need to work on. They won't care. They won't care about what they do. However, we've got to be able to do that. How do we build resilience into it? How do we make sure that we design for it, but also making sure it's our advantage and use that, as Greg said, as part of that deterrence package. How you turn off energy solutions. How do you use different solutions that give you that operational advantage? I think that's where we've got to get a bit more joined up on.
Okay.
Yep, I think that we should expect that they perhaps won't restrict themselves in the same way that we would. And for me, that's just a fact that we know. But our citizens that we defend demand that their militaries operate by the rule of law. And they expect that the use of force is done in an ethical way. And however we do automation and artificial intelligence, or crewed or uncrewed, must meet our citizens' demands. And we have to figure out how to do that and have an advantage.
Okay, thank you, General. There's a couple of questions that I wanted to put to you as well. One is from Matthew Atkinson. How reliant is NATO on the provision of US carrier strike groups and maintaining an effective deterrent force in the Indo-Pacific? Could this be shared with others, particularly if their carriers can't project similar air power as US carriers, but also because of the vast distances in the Indo-Pacific? This is from Doug Englund. Air transportation may be obviously the only option in some locations, but some can't support a runway. How can we solve vertical lift capabilities in the future?
Yes, there's quite a bit of talk inside the U.S. Air Force about high-speed VTOL, and I suspect that at some point in the future, probably not in the near term, we may invest in that technology to be runway independent. But our entire force right now, except for the few helicopters and tilt rotors that we have, require a runway. And so between now and when we, when we get to that point where we can operate independent of runways, we can't give up on our aircraft that need runways. So we have to figure out a way to operate from airfields, perhaps even in an area that is vulnerable to attack. And so that resiliency of taking an attack, repairing the airfield, and getting airborne again is something that we have to be able to do, hence agile combat employment. The person who sent the question is exactly right. The distances are great. Air power is a way to get there quickly. Another option is space lift, which a number of companies are thinking about, which allows you to go a lot faster than air power. And of course, sea lift is an option as well, which we would intend to use in our execution. So all of the above. I mean, we're not using space lift yet, but that's something that could be a player.
Just an example, though, I think where I do think carrier naval aviation has shown resiliency. So when the Queen Elizabeth deployed, they were doing joint operations with large deck U.S. Navy, with the Marine Corps small deck, and the Queen Elizabeth. So aircraft would launch off Queen Elizabeth, may go to shore, may go to the Marine ship, may go to the big boat. You don't know, and vice versa. And so that was, I think, pretty insightful relative to distributed operations. And oh, by the way, we were able to catch and launch those airplanes in all those environments. And so I really think that helps in terms from an agile ACE kind of employment environment. So I do think there's still quite a bit of resiliency within that construct.
Right, and to answer the first part of the question, I think very reliant would be the way that I would pose it, especially in this time of competition where that was a big investment for the UK to send the Queen Elizabeth all the way through the Indo-Pacific for an extended voyage. That says something. That says something to their allies and partners. It also says something to their challengers in the region, or their adversaries in the region, that is very useful and helpful in this time of challenge.
Well, that segues quite nicely onto a question from Peter Cook. Does the UK need to increase its military capabilities to play a meaningful role in the Indo-Pacific region beyond AUKUS? And if yes, where should the UK invest?
You're asking me?
Yes.
I think that's a question for the citizens of the UK to answer.
Well, I suppose drawing on your expertise and your insights, perhaps you
we'll take them full time. But you obviously have your national interest. But I'm confident that the UK can figure out what's the right balance.
Richard Berthon, do you have anything you can add?
Yeah, I mean, as the program lead for FRAeS and GCAP, I think investing in that is a pretty good start. And for our naval colleagues, clearly the investment in AUKUS and submarines is right at the heart of that, and we've heard about carrier. And I think space capabilities is clearly an area where they give a global flexibility, a global responsiveness that is vital. So there's not one area, but it's a contribution that the UK has clearly signalled in our integrated review, a very strong focus on the Indo-Pacific. We clearly have some very close to home national interests in the Euro-Atlantic theatre as well, but there's an ambition, and I think increasingly we are thinking about the threats in that environment and trying to work out what is it that are there different threats, or do they drive different military requirements than those that we perhaps have more traditionally focused on, at least in recent decades, in the Middle East or the Euro-Atlantic.
Okay, thank you. Now there's a question which has come through. Just how collaborative is the China-Russia relationship with regard to military capabilities? Brendan Mulvaney, can you add anything to this?
Yeah, overall it's pretty limited. I mean, it's bigger than it used to be. It's growing. The power balance has shifted in that more toward China, away from Russia. Especially, this is even true before the invasion of Ukraine. But you're not going to see Russian troops helping invade Taiwan. You're not going to see the PLA in Ukraine anytime soon. It's a geopolitical strategic partnership. They have the Venn diagram, right, overlaps there. But we shouldn't forget that the entire reason that the United States of America has relations with the PRC is because the PRC was afraid that Russia was going to nuke Beijing, which they actually had plans to do, which we found at the end of the Cold War. And so there's not a long, deep-seated, loving relationship like there is between us and the Brits, us and the Aussies, obviously the Canadians. It's just a matter of, it's more than convenience, but it is a strong military alliance. And even the limited exercises that they do tend to stay the vast majority of on each side of their border. So they'll do it in a cross-border area, but most of the Chinese forces stay in China, most of the Russian forces stay in Russia, and that's their combined exercise. So
we have a question from Norbert Newman. As China, it's hard not to perceive the West's military build-up in the region, AUKUS or US troops and hardware based in South Korea, the Philippines, etc., as encirclement. How do we ensure we deter without triggering conflict? Brendan, let me ask for your take on this first of all, and then I'll get the General's perspective.
Yeah, my problem is I disagree with the premise of the question, right? I don't think that anything that we're doing is going to push China to make the decisions, right? It's going to be, China's clearly said what they wanted. There was a comment earlier saying, when people say what they are, you should probably listen to them. It's very clear. We have the whole series of, in their own words at GASCC, listen to the Chinese, listen to what they want to do. I don't think anything that we're doing is going to push them any farther or faster or into any of those decisions. We just need to deter them from the time that they think that they're able to achieve that.
General?
I completely agree. And the one thing that I would add is there's a potential for a crisis to flare up in some of the activities that we're seeing, especially in the air and at sea, where China interacts closely with forces that belong to the U.S. and other allies that are operating in and near their shores. And I would say that we do everything that we can to comply with international law. And in fact, we do comply with international law. And we find sometimes they don't, both in the air and at sea. And I think it's imperative for all of us to make sure that when those events happen, we discuss them without getting into a crisis. But it could be very easily misinterpreted, and you could have a miscalculation that could lead to a crisis. And so complying with international law and norms in the air and at sea is a way to really reduce the potential for crisis. And sometimes we don't see that from the Chinese.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is there another question coming from the floor? Because we've got a few minutes left, and I don't want to leave anybody out. I don't think so. So I just want to really, I think, end on this last question. Richard, I don't know whether you can start in response. This is from Jim Belden, Leidos UK. Noting that Japan's defence spending has doubled, how can they best contribute to maintaining a free and open Pacific? And what's the panel's view on the implications for the pacifistic Article 9 of Japan's constitution?
Japan's announced its intention to reach 2% of GDP in defence by 2027, I think. It has set out in its strategy documents at the end of last year a set of what are very ambitious and forward-looking military capability investments as part of its self-defence. Those, of course, include what I'm working with them on, but are much wider than that. I think that the threats to Japanese territorial airspace, the sort of incursions that you're talking about, and the volume of those, does suggest combat air and control of the air is something that really matters to their self-defence. They've got a pretty robust, and I think it's quite eye-catching just how far they have come in the last few years, in the last few years of Abe's government, but since then, perhaps even more so. Japan, I won't get into debates on the pacifist constitution. What they are clear they're doing is looking at their three principles on defence collaboration, defence exports, and I think that shows an understanding that for them international collaboration is at the heart of many of their future solutions, and that to do that they have to be able to work with partners in a way that perhaps a reinterpretation of those three principles as they've announced initial policy response, but further work to do. And I think that's a really strong direction of travel.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Did you want to come in?
I was saying, just to echo what Richard was saying, is from an industrial perspective, the collaboration, the technology, the willingness to step forward is not of a nation who's not wanting to have sovereign military capability and step beyond where they are today. The work that they've done, they've located themselves in the UK. We've got teams in Japan. it's been absolutely critical, and they are very much using this to drive against that threat window and, you know, in that combat air domain, but also the wider aperture of their ambition to collaborate further with the UK across the defence spectrum.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We've got 48 seconds to go on this panel. So I think I'm going to wrap up now, and I'm going to use this time to ensure you give a great round of applause to the panellists, because we've had a really fascinating